And we are live. This is Dark Journalist, and it's great to be here with everyone for episode 26 of the X series. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we are live. This is Dark Journalist, and it's great to be here with everyone. That's yours or mine?
That is yours.
Let's start that again. It is great to be here, everyone. And we're on episode 26 of the X series. And one of the fantastic things that we've arrived at going through those first 25 weeks of getting the X series out is that we've created an overall picture, a kind of a symmetry. And now I think we understand the X Steganography is not only something that's rampant through these different secret programs that we've seen go through the government, but that we're taking the step back in time and seeing that the X has worked as a symbol for these secret societies and mystery centers and the mystery schools to really communicate with each other. So, and communicate over time these great secrets that are hidden in plain sight. And so that only an initiate may understand, or someone in the know there. So he who knows, she who knows. So one of the things I do want to point out as we start here, and there's so many things, of course, to catch up on. The last episode that we did was Tua Didanan, and Olivia and I really had a great time going through the responses on those, because although we've had, episodes that, I think the Tesla Trump episode had something like 140,000 views. The Tua Didanan episode had such a quality of a response to it that the people were spending so much time with it. Didn't you think that? Did you get that impression?
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's quite remarkable. And the Tua Didanan and the Two-Eye Stone and that connection being that whole Atlantis and Ireland goes really back into the primeval past and gives us that feeling that, wow, we're really connected to that. And there were strange things that day too. Even the lighting was very interesting. Mm-hmm. It was almost like that Tua Didanan mist was here for the first 20 minutes or so. It was completely out of anyone's control. But we made it through, and that episode, I think, connects up a lot of dots. This episode is going to be a complete breakthrough episode, because one of the things we alluded to over the summer in an episode dealing with the leader of Anthroposophy, named Rudolf Steiner, of course, and his deep philosophy and esoteric overview of spiritual science, we come across this twin area that's complex and a mystery. On one side, it's the eighth sphere, which only so much can get spoken about. And on the other side is Ahriman, which again, came out more and more as things progressed in his work. Initially, I don't think Ahriman was really such at the point of it. But what happened was that with Anthroposophy and with Steiner, when we got into that period of around World War I, he decided that Theosophy and Anthroposophy and some of these public mystery schools were failing, and that the public was failing to grasp the message. So therefore, he let a number of things out that maybe wouldn't have come out and made it to us in the public, and we're lucky enough to be the recipients of all that. So this is the nature of the situation of how we get these two great mysteries, the eighth sphere and on the one side, and Ahriman on the other. And what we're going to find is that Ahriman is the caretaker, the creator, the progenitor of the eighth sphere, and he's the person who is going to really, the force that's going to control that. And the idea behind it, we're going to go very deeply into it tonight. Now, we've certainly touched on it, and it is something that when we touch on the mystery schools, we've certainly brought in, but it's going to be nothing like tonight, which is going to take people completely by surprise with its connection to something called Cern out there, which is a major scientific program. And, what we're going to find out is that Cern actually is a sovereign entity, as it turns out, with a military budget of over $8 billion, a military-style budget. It's not, it's openly announced as just a scientific program. But it's largely set up now around the Higgs boson and the discovery of the Higgs boson and the particle collider, and that's where so much of this phantom funding is coming from, supposedly to discover it. Then they said they discovered it, and some other scientists said, wait. But while they were in that process of creating it and doing these tests and smashing these particles together to try to recreate the Big Bang as this kind of transhumanist wonder of trying to figure out if we could recreate the universe, a number of scientists actually filed suit against them. One case I'll cite was in Hawaii, where a group of scientists said that the possibility existed that in their experiments, they could be largely hazardous to the environment on the Earth by releasing these strangelets directly into the atmosphere, basically small black holes. And that they felt that this was significant, and also that the ionosphere had incredible effects when this thing was turned on. That is, when the juice went on. Another thing that we discovered along the line is that CERN is the #1 user of the internet. So, you know, it's something to be contended with regardless of where your beliefs go. Now, tonight we're going to bring in a large degree of esoteric science and a large degree of a kind of a mysticism cosmology look at CERN to relate it to the eighth sphere and some of these things that we've seen. And this really cuts to the heart of it because, you know, we've seen a lot of things out there with people reporting on it willy-nilly and saying, well, it's just a, you know, scientific program doing this Higgs boson thing. And then on the other side, we've seen very deep, you know, religious groups looking at it and saying they're channeling demons. And once in a while, you know, you see these kind of taglines about it. But somewhere right in the middle, actually, is the real truth around it, because it certainly is no ordinary scientific project. Let's start with that. And on the other hand, it is also associated with some very unusual occult rituals. So these things are in the public record and can't be denied. So we need to discover, how does this all relate to what we're talking about? Well, what kind of entity is CERN and the Hadron Collider that is part of it, and especially the Alice Collider, which is, as we know, created after Alice in Wonderland. And if you watched our Alice in Wonderland episode, which is one of the most popular in the series, you'll find out that CERN and Alice in Wonderland have a great connection to the mathematical theories of our friend, the author of Alice in Wonderland. So, you know, we're looking at some very interesting connections as we go back there and find that these authors from the 19th century who were working with mystery schools were connected with a very high echelon of political power. And as a result of that, we need to look at them and their connections very differently. Now, Lewis Carroll, being very connected to groups like the Orphic Circle, Charles Dickens, Bulwer Lytton, all of these groups being associated with the Rosicrucians, and the Orphic Circle, which we only got to know about through the work of Emma Britton, who brought it out and told us about who was in it and how they had used her for a period of time. And, you know, that brought us into Theosophy, because Emma Britton was tied in with Helena Blavatsky, and Blavatsky, who was the leader of Theosophy, said, well, there was never a medium in history like Emma Britton. So, you know, we start to understand these things a little bit better when they're connected, and not connected in a wrong way, which is also something that we can get into trouble with. So I've spent a lot of time in doing this, using the X Steganography that we've discovered in a variety of secret government programs relating to advanced technology, hearkening that back to the work of the mystery schools and how it goes as far back as something like the Book of the Dead in ancient Egypt. So what is the X Steganography? Let's just touch on that real briefly. So if I use a symbol that is a way to communicate to different initiates, those who know something, I need to leave that symbol right where everyone can see it, because if I were to kind of create a situation where I was using a cryptic code, then someone stumbles into it and realizes it and starts to figure it out and all the rest of it. One of the original people who gave us the steganography in the first place is this very interesting mystic in Germany who was in a monastery and was an honorable mystic working under this kind of Christian umbrella. And he wanted to get so much information out, and he decided in this book literally to out what steganography was, which was literally a text within a text. So in this one wild text that he let out, there were all these truths that were in there for people who would know, who were initiated into these groups. So I think that gives us some idea about it. Now, I've related it, and people have seen me do this for a number of shows, relating it to things like, the secret space program, presidents like Nixon, JFK, Eisenhower, who left behind these different time capsules associated with X for when that X gets out there, so that their work associated with it can be exposed, and so that their credit can be given, basically. And what's fascinating to me is that when you get into things that people talk about relating to the UFO file, people go off in so many different directions there. But what's fascinating to me is that X is always the signature of how to maintain the secrecy over time. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. So what I like to do in order to get this full picture is to swing wildly from 2018 back to about 1888 and keep that swing going so that we get a pretty good picture of what's in between. And then we'll find that those people that we're focusing on will go very far back into antediluvian times to explain the X to us. And they're trying to pass this along. But given the groups and the oaths that they take and the kind of secret loyalties that they have in these groups, they can't just come out and say certain things. So as we understand it from groups like Anthroposophy and the work of Rudolf Steiner, in about 1840, they were faced with a gigantic conundrum. And the conundrum was simple. It was this, that in looking ahead, a certain number of that group inside those mystery schools realized that in about 100 years, by the mid-20th century, humanity wouldn't be recognizable because they would have been subject to such scientific materialism by these forces that were weighing on them. And we were seeing it in terms of industrialization and moving into this phase. It was a spiritual and physical consideration. So what they had to do was devise a way to let information out, certain special types of information relating to the nature of reality out from these schools into the general public. And they had to do it and be careful in such a way because many of the groups they were associated with believed in secrecy as the highest duty. So therefore, were completely against any revelations. And the idea from the basic mystery schools that kept the secrecy was this: we'll keep letting little secrets out. The public will catch on. We'll guide them. We'll let this secret out. We'll let that secret out. But we'll maintain the higher echelon of knowledge behind these mystery school walls. But the small contingent that was seeing into the future, taking a look at the situation, was saying, look, it's not going to work. If you get into 100 years from now, these people won't even be able to accept the truths. It won't matter about the mysteries because they will have become solidified and rigidified into these scientific materialism and these beliefs. Now, scientific materialism hit very hard in the 1840s. So this was a tough decision on the part of the mystery schools. But what they did is they let out information relating to life after death, relating to psychic phenomena, and so forth. And they worked with special individuals, like Andrew Jackson Davis. The Poughkeepsie Seer is somebody who's cited in this, the Fox sisters, a number of people who brought this other reality into our daily lives. And there it was. Eventually, this became problematic because what was happening was a ghost craze, basically, kicked up in the United States, and was kicked off even further by the fact that Abraham Lincoln and his wife were so into spiritualism and contacting their deceased son and so on. So it really created this kind of craze atmosphere that was easily manipulated instead of this gradual awakening that the mystery schools were looking for. So I think it's quite remarkable when we look at this period to see what was happening was that the mystery schools were trying to help us as this wave of scientific materialism was closing in and really locking humanity into a cage, which would forever sever it from its true self, which is its spiritual spark and its much larger heritage. It was locking people into that very narrow, I can only believe in what is measured physically. which, is one very small aspect of reality when you get right down to it. So we had all these kind of tussles back and forth inside the mystery schools. Indeed, I would almost refer to it as a mystery school war. But what happened is that there was a compromise reached at a certain point where they were going to allow Helena Blavatsky to come forward, who was somebody who was kind of a maverick in a sense, but they knew how advanced she was in terms of her psychic capabilities, her past life development, and her abilities as a seer to kind of engage the mysteries and touch upon the mysteries in a way that we hadn't been able to do since thousands of years ago. Ordinary people had long ago lost this ability to do this. Now, Blavatsky became the compromised character and in an incredible fashion was sent over to America to start and form this public mystery school called Theosophy, and ran into all kinds of problems as a result of it, because all the mystery schools here in America were tied up with political activities. And so therefore, everything that they did was political, and they were worried not only about their esoteric secrets with her around, being from Russia, and this kind of like, free agent in a sense, and a woman in this period of time. So she comes out and she produces this book called Isis Unveiled. And Isis Unveiled reveals things that were never meant by the mystery schools to be put on the record. So there are some groups inside these mystery schools who helped her, but they're actually small. In fact, Rudolf Steiner at one point pointed to 14 individuals. Now you can imagine how large the mystery schools are. We're talking about subtle groups, sure, but you had completely around the world, the UK, Asia, Europe, America. So for only 14 individuals to come forward and say, we need this to happen and we're going to work with this person, they represent a tiny portion, probably less than 1%. And they were the ones who made it happen. And once the cat was out of the bag, well, things started to change there towards the end of the 19th century, and more information came forward. And this is where we arrive at the work of Rudolf Steiner, who joined the Theosophical Society in 1902 at the behest of Annie Besant. Now, I want to introduce a few VIPs in this picture before we get to the real hardcore stuff relating to the Eighth Sphere and Ahriman. So let's do that. But before I do that, I'm going to check in with Miss Olivia. Mm-hmm. How are you doing over there?
I'm doing great. I would like to take a second and give a great shout out to Epic Journeyman and Najat Madri for attempting to identify all of the images in the new GJ promo.
Yes.
They both did a phenomenal job.
Wow, I was shocked actually, because it's hard.
It is hard.
It's hard for somebody to keep up with that. We put out a 2-minute trailer of the X series. It's available on this channel or at darkjournalist.com. But if you're on the YouTube channel, it's there. It's the latest video. And it just captures everything that we've been talking. And there are more promos that are coming up that capitalize on the visuals that we've been introducing here, and just sort of short snippets for people to get an introduction into what the X series is all about, because we're very deep into the language of the X Steganography, and we want to make sure that people have that easy reference to figure out what is it that's going on here, because we have some people here like Najat and I forget who else you mentioned, but there are people out there who really are getting what's in the series, and we get emails from them on a regular basis. We've been getting some incredible emails. Just the volume of emails coming our way has been phenomenal, and I really appreciate it. Again, you're watching Dark Journalist, and I want to recommend now that you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our weekly newsletter. And what happens there is you sign up for the newsletter and you get a quick response back. It's just to make sure it's a real email address. And then you click on that and you're set, pretty much. And the only thing that will happen after that is you get a weekly email every Friday letting you know what shows are coming up and the show for that night that will be live, and the live link to it. We've seen incredible, and I mean incredible, censorship and incredible shutdowns. And we've had our own struggles with it, but these aren't the kind of things I like to really get into, but we've been seeing the crackdown. That is obvious, and everyone can see that. And you've seen it all across this swath of alternative media. A lot of it's targeting conservative media because of the election that's coming up, but that's part of a larger plan to just throw ideas out and make Twitter and Google and people like Facebook the arbiters, the ultimate judges of what is decent content and what should be out there. And if they don't agree with it, it ain't the truth. So that's the kind of electronic book burning phase that we're in. And as a result, my suggestion is get on that mailing list now. Go to darkjournalist.com, take the 30 seconds and do it right now. You just plug in your email address and your name. Get on that list now, because that's the way that we're going to stay in touch. Let's face it.
I just wanted to say Chuck is in the house if you want to say
Hey, hi. Chuck, unbelievable. And this is an incredible person, an incredible musician. And as the evening wears on, I'm sure we'll figure out just what band he is playing for. Mm-hmm. But we have mentioned it before. So it's nice to have you out there, Chuck. The other thing I want to mention is that, with this crackdown that we're seeing relating to the media, a lot of the object of it now is to not just control the political discourse, but they're going to move from that political discourse into areas of deeper knowledge, into the esoteric. As soon as they realize how they can kind of close down one side of the internet, they'll keep on doing it. So this is what we need to expect and anticipate. So highly recommend that we get that one-on-one channel going. Does that sound about right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I want to read a few quotes as we get into the Steiner Eighth Sphere episode. And, there's a few things about Steiner I want to bring up, which is that he sacrificed a great deal to build Anthroposophy. And that Anthroposophy is a more vital network of institutions and different spin-offs, like biodynamic farming, for example, Waldorf schools. These things are very 21st century. And all I can tell you is that everything that Steiner did was so far ahead of his time. And what I really like when I got into Steiner's work is that there was this artistic aspect to it. And the artistic aspect was related to eurythmy, which was this series of movements that were meant to, kind of open up the people who were working on it, very much like the Gurdjieff movements, in that in the body, there were all of these things that could be triggered that would kind of open the awareness. But also, like the Gurdjieff movements, that there are a number of things that can be told and communicated through movement. This is absolutely fascinating. But it should be noted that Rudolf Steiner also wrote 4 mystery dramas as part of this kind of artistic wing, and the incredible artsy side and the things that he let out in those mystery dramas is very important, and we're going to touch on those tonight also. I want to start with some quotes relating to Steiner and the Eighth Sphere. Let's take a quick look at Steiner here. I'd say this is at his prime in Anthroposophy. Just get a real feel for the man. He achieved remarkable things in 64 years. And oddly enough, I'm going to reveal a few things tonight that aren't usually talked about in relation to Steiner. One of them is the fact that, he didn't die a natural death. I'll put it to you that way. This is the building that he designed. Of course, he was deep into architecture and sculpture. This is the Goetheanum. And we get a real feeling just looking at that. You can imagine just being inside there, how your consciousness would shift. It's just that kind of a building. But what's also remarkable is that the Nazis were so threatened by this that they burned it down in very early on, before the Nazis even seized power, when they were just one of these groups that were out there. But they didn't like the competition on the esoteric side, you could say. They had their own program that they were going to run. One of the things that is a key and a symbol to the third mystery in the set of 4 mystery plays that Steiner provided was this. And that is clearly the X being indicated there. And it has a little bit of that turn of the Theosophical X, which is where, as we found out over time, that old symbol was adopted and taken really from these different mystical groups and then twisted topsy-turvy and created a swastika and all these other things. But the X as the symbol for his third mystery drama is going to become important. So I want to point that out. The other thing is that in the mystery play, the movements associated with the third mystery play have this core for eurythmy, which is clearly an X movement. And as I said, like the Gurdjieff movements, there are things that are read there for people who can see. In this case, the X Steganography gets a little bit deeper, but when we get to Ahriman, it really gets deeper. And some of these, this is an indication of the movement and what the symbol recreates in the movement of eurythmy. It's important for us to just have a handle on the type of work, very delicate work that these people were doing to bring deep, deep esoteric truth. Okay, so Steiner tells us then that we get into this situation where the mystery schools let this information out and that Blavatsky creates this magnificent theosophical society, but it's a rocky road. And she lets out Isis Unveiled, and there's a few things that relate to Isis Unveiled which weren't meant to get out, basically. So the mystery schools are furious and they're going into overdrive. But before Blavatsky is done, she's going to reveal so many of their secrets that some of those people inside those mystery schools are going to be like, where did she get that from? I'm a high-ranking member, and even I don't know that. So there's a real pivot here. There's an incredible fissure that opens up between this public mystery school theosophy and the secret mystery schools that are trying to bring out these truths on one hand, and on the other hand, hold back. In the middle of all that, so we can get a really nice round picture, are what's called these brotherhoods of the left hand. And the left hand bringing forward these what are called materialist initiates. That is, they're working with the same type of secrecy, the same type of magic, if you will, the same type of deep, deep ancient knowledge, but they're not doing it for the advancement of humanity. They're doing it more along the lines of kind of a black magic goal, which is they're using it for domination. But they have to be managed. That is, you know, it's not like when these schools have different rankings of knowledge. And one of the things that goes on is that, you know, these schools can't attack other schools. All they can do is maintain what they have and do it that way. So when they have other schools out there that are with these materialist initiates, you know, it just so happens they're going to share information. Now, interestingly enough, when we get to Ahriman, which is this character and this Ahrimanic forces that Steiner talks about in relation to the eighth sphere, and one of the main problems that humanity faces going into the 21st century, as he was seeing ahead there 100 years, is basically that the Ahrimanic forces are all about getting into humanity through technology and having humanity adopt into technology like a machine so that they can control the machine in essence. So let's get just a quick quote about how we got into the eighth sphere business in the first place. The eighth sphere was regarded as one of the biggest secrets, by the way, by the mystery schools until it was let out in a book called Esoteric Buddhism by A.P. Sinnett, who, oddly enough, he was a member of Theosophy, but he was a banker in England who had this like epiphany to join Blavatsky. And he had quite an interesting, you know, kind of group of books, about 3 books. And Blavatsky put all kinds of faith in him, and he was this very kind of educated guy. But in Steiner's eyes, he was sort of irresponsible and came to wrong conclusions and things along this line. So there's a lot of that between Theosophy and Steiner, which is how Anthroposophy, you know, grew out of the fact that he quit Theosophy and started his own, you know, realizing that Theosophy was moving into this Eastern direction. Okay. So these are some quotes that are from Blavatsky relating to what will later be known as the eighth sphere. And she actually mentions it by name a couple of times. But just to give us this idea, this was in there in Theosophy, and then we'll go from there. So she says, the shells, the astral shells of lost souls do not remain for any great length of time in the atmosphere of the earth, but like straws floating near a whirlpool, get caught up and drowned dragged down in that terrible maelstrom, which hurries off the failures towards disintegration. Now, she said, where it takes them is, in other words, the planet of matter and death, the mental as well as the physical satellite of our Earth. This is the first mention of this eighth sphere, and many people presumed she meant the moon because this was, stated about the physical satellite of our Earth. Well, we're going to get into why she said that. Next up, bad, irretrievably bad, must be that ego that yields no might from its fifth principle, has to be annihilated to disappear in the eighth sphere. Okay, so we're talking about someone who gets so deep in their ego that they're just irretrievable in a sense. And they are a good candidate to get kind of sucked into this environment. The next one is this. So what she says is, there's not much mystery left now in the riddle of the eighth sphere. These are topics indeed on which adepts are very reserved in their communications to uninitiated pupils. Okay, so then AP Senate comes out and says that this eighth sphere, which is this zone where humanity gets harvested and disappeared into by these lower astral beings. So this is a very deep kind of cosmology we're getting a feeling on. But it rang a lot of alarm bells throughout the mystery schools, according to Steiner. And he in particular said that they were attributing it to the moon, and that it was completely wrong use, but also that this was something that the public really couldn't absorb, this whole concept of the eighth sphere, and it's very highly held secret deep in the mystery schools. And there's a reason for that, which is that it can be easily exploited. So in essence, the eighth sphere is a realm, and all of these planets have their counterparts, which are basically etheric realms, and they relate more to our soul spiritual life, but they also relate to our mental body. So when a human being projects themselves in a situation through imagination, or holds a kind of a thought form throughout their life, when they die, they kind of get inhabited. They move into the thought forms that they create here on Earth. One of the things that happens, according to Theosophy and Anthroposophy, is that we have a natural reincarnation cycle, and that the reincarnation cycle takes us through these different planetary lives, not as a physical body, but developing our mental counterparts, spiritual aspects through our solar system. This is what their wheel of karma looks like. And it's a wheel of development, really. But one of the things that happens here is that these lower astral beings, which Steiner identified as Ahriman, create a false step, an intermediary step between what would happen normally in the course of evolution with our souls and with our spiritual bodies, and with the way that we reincarnate through these different lives, advancing in different lives all the way from Atlantis through to the present. And it takes this kind of artificial step into the eighth sphere and then brings the person back to Earth, forever keeping them in this lower evolutionary cycle where the Ahrimanic forces are in charge. That is what the cosmology coming out of Theosophy and Anthroposophy states. So Steiner really, in my opinion, spent something along the lines of 3 decades trying to explain this to the public. You have all these different lectures, you have all these, books. How to Know Higher Worlds is his most famous book. And he's describing all these principles and all these abilities that we have in this period that we're in, and how there are different root races through time, and we take different evolutionary steps, and that the next evolutionary step that we're going to take in the next root race is the ability to possess our spiritual faculties consciously. And that there's a group that's determined, that's both physical and ethereal, lower astral, to not let that happen, because then we kind of get all of our autonomy, and we're not subject to, rulers and ideas about religion that are, say, hindering us from advancement. So we go into this kind of situation where these lower beings have this idea, schematic, which is to trick people, in essence, into the eighth sphere. And once they're in the eighth sphere, they go round and round. And it's very appealing to the ego. And it very much, as he was reading it out, and as you go deep, deep on the Steiner material relating to this, it sounds a lot like virtual reality. And remember, Steiner is so advanced. And although he died in 1925, he really left a legacy that looks very much like he could be talking right about today. So it's quite fascinating. What he also said in 1916, and I think we all need to pay attention to this, is that if the mystery schools failed there, and he felt that they had with the advent of World War I, that there would be a chance again for them, and that the chance for anthroposophy, the chance for theosophy, this whole thing would come back around in 100 years, which is 2016, and have a 20 to 30 year window to accomplish it again. So that taking us basically from 2016 to 2046. This is the window of time. And we're 2 years into the window now. And here we are talking about it. So that gives us, I think, an outline of what we're talking about in relation to this. I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journals. And it seems like we have a big crowd tonight. Olivia, how are the questions going over there?
Would you want to... Should I throw one at you right now?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, BV wants to know, would the eighth sphere be something related to the Mormon concept of spirit prison?
I think that that's correct. The thing is, I'll tell you an interesting thing. Whenever I've studied Mormonism, and I've gone pretty in depth with it at times, it's odd how many things they get right from an esoteric point of view. Now, how the Mormons went from, going from an archaeological story into this larger spiritual story and knowing a lot of these esoteric facts is quite fascinating, I think. And there's space aspects to it. I mean, it's quite fascinating. But one of the things I think that we can say about Mormonism is that at some point, later, the leader, Joseph Smith, is walking around in a military uniform and running for president. And then he dies. He gets assassinated during that process. And it's quite fascinating. But it does seem like something went wrong there in what they were trying to execute. And Mormonism is intriguing. And I think we have to take a look at it and sort of deconstruct it to figure out how it came to be what it was. But certainly that idea that those tribes moved out, and one of the tribes from the lost tribes of Israel came to America, I absolutely think that they're on solid ground there. In terms of that wider concept, their spirit prison could very well be the eighth sphere. We know that the eighth sphere, instead of being hell, I want to refer to it, it's more like a purgatory, seems to capture it better than something that would be like hell or something like that. There are other traditions that back this up also. I remember there are these Casey readings discussing when he goes into what the role of the planets is from a cosmological, from an esoteric standpoint. And he talks about Saturn basically being a maximum security prison. I think very much about this eighth sphere thing. But in the eighth sphere thing, I think we're being drawn away by pleasure. We're being drawn away by the pleasure of very two-dimensional scientific thinking that we are it, basically, and that there's no other spiritual factors to relate to. And that this is the whole thrust of the scientific materialism and why it came into such a problem in 1840, as Steiner pointed out, why the drastic moves were made by the mystery schools. And we, in my opinion, looking at this in 2018 now with the research that I've done and looking at all these great researchers who've looked at things relating to the mystery schools and relating to some of the advanced technology programs that we have now, the way that I look at it is like this. In essence, the X Steganography key is the first real window, in my opinion, into how this works. And that we can read things like anthroposophy and theosophy and understand it better. And we can locate events in the 20th century and the 21st century and some of the political forces that are vying for power and relate it much more. We go deep state on one hand, you're really going deep mystery school because those forces are wrapped up in it. And all we have going round and round in terms of alternative research predominantly are people running around after some faction and saying, well, the elite, they like to do human sacrifice, or so they get into this whole thing, and it misses the point. It becomes like in 1984 in George Orwell, they had the 2 minutes hate, which is everyone would get together and they would flash this face on the screen, and it was supposed to be this traitor to the cause, and everybody would get their hate out in 2 minutes and then go back to work. And it kept them in this state, and it let out that it kept them in this kind of psychotic state, basically. So we have to be very careful when we get at these things, when we're looking at them. If we can look at a group like the Rockefellers and deconstruct what their aim is, if we can see through them to the fears that they're dealing with, we'll have a much better vantage point. We'll get a lot more knowledge than if we just morally judge any group that's out there and say, well, forget about it. Now, at the same time, we have to politically look at groups like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and say, well, you're doing destructive things politically. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we have to get ourselves cleared that working politically is a very small perspective, that we need to get the wider picture of what these people are manipulating things for. And I think we go into a much deeper question than that. Okay, the first quotes from Theosophy relating to the eighth sphere, we've gone through them. Anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, what he thinks, basically, relating to the eighth sphere. I've grabbed some of my favorite quotes relating to Steiner. Some of them are going to blow your mind, and maybe you've never heard them. But we'll start with these. What Lucifer and Ahriman would love to do is be able to take the wisdom of the gods, lock, stock, and barrel, and transfer it to the eighth sphere. So they're harvesting knowledge, Ahriman, and Lucifer is included here, and he separates the two as well. And that gets pretty deep, actually, because those are two different forces that are talking about it, and he wants us to understand them independently of each other. Next quote. If everything were to run without a hitch for Lucifer and Ahriman, if they were everywhere able to rest as much as they rest from the organ of the head, Earth evolution would soon reach a point where Ahriman could succeed in destroying the Earth and in leading over all evolution of worlds into the eighth sphere, so that the Earth evolution as a whole would take a different course. Hence, they endeavor to unfold their greatest strength of all at the place where man is the most vulnerable, namely in the head. This is very interesting because you and I on the ground, looking at things like MK Ultra or looking at mind control programs and looking at these different things, we get into a very interesting situation because we start to see that they've been manipulating the mind of these people and manipulating the mind of the public. But when you're looking at it as someone like Steiner, you're looking at the entire cosmic impact, the cosmological, spiritual, psychospiritual impact, which is different than just looking at it politically and saying, oh, they swayed these people politically and boom, they used mind control to do it. They're looking at the wider impacts of the entire thing. So Steiner's saying the Ahriman and Lucifer target the head. He's looking at it from an esoteric point of view. But let's go further. This one, I think, he says, when we speak of the attacks of the Ahrimanic powers, such things as are indicated are prepared long beforehand. These attacks begin actually to operate during the 4th or 5th century of the post-Atlantean epoch. And he separates things into the Atlantean epoch, the post-Atlantean epoch. There's different sets. So there's a Greco-Latin period, there's a medieval period. And he's talking about these different periods. But he says, behind the curtains of world history, even before the beginning of the epoch, the current epoch, complete and intense preparation was made by the Luciferic and Ahrimanic powers. Their plan was to bring all human faculties and human forces of will under the sway of a longing to be alienated from the earth, to leave the earth and build up a separate planetary body, the eighth sphere, while the earth was to be deserted and left desolate. As I say, the very strongest attacks have been undertaken. So their goal is to harvest the individualities, the identities, the soul essence of humanity, where they rule and they have the upper hand and we kind of worship them. So this is a cosmological point of view which says that the same way that you worship a deity or how they worship the goddess in previous times moves us into how they want to be worshipped. And the lower astral entity called Ahriman is something that's very interesting because Steiner identified it this way, and yet Ahriman comes out of the Persian religions, and it comes out of the battles between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, and they are twins. And Ahura Mazda is the good twin, and basically Ahriman's the evil twin. And Ahura Mazda takes them on in all the different battles that they have. I have a few images of this. Ahriman is always depicted as this chimerical form. He is always a combination of animals. And the way that Ahura Mazda battles him is that it takes everything that he has. So he always has to hold the horn on his head while he's thrusting a sword into his stomach. It's like a full metal jacket. And what happens, what I think is fascinating about this is that, you know, when we're looking at Ahura Mazda, in those texts, instead of just portraying him as this great light bringer or whatever, they really say that he has to work hard to take Ahriman down. This is a shot of Ahura Mazda getting power basically to his third eye to take on Ahriman. Now, that is, you know, it's a fascinating piece of the Zoroastrian story that gets us into this creation battle between good and evil. And the evil aspect is Ahriman on this side. As a matter of fact, there are times in the Steiner literature where he compares Ahriman and Lucifer, and he says, well, there are times when that pleasure-seeking aspect that goes on in the kind of Luciferic rites that the Greeks had and the Dionysian rites and all that had actually worked against at cross purposes with Ahriman, because Ahriman is so dense and is so granite-like and is so wanting to take people off the earth that if they experience too much pleasure here on the earth, they won't want to be carted off to the eighth sphere. So they had to kind of recalibrate what they were going to do. But in any way, I think an easy way for us to grasp it is the Ahrimanic powers all work from a scientific point of view. That is, the way that they've figured out that they can, the most seductive thing that they can do is science. Because science robs humanity of its basic understanding of who it is. So basic identity gets robbed. Once the identity is gone, the connection to your spiritual center is gone. It's like putting a shield down and letting this astral force in. So this is in essence what Steiner is spelling out in relation to Ahriman and the eighth sphere and the transferring over to the eighth sphere. Now, I want to get into this more, but I want to relate it to the period that we're in. And when you hear so many things, you know, like, do you want to have disease X or adopt gender X? And the things that we're seeing now. The transhumanists move through the people like Ray Kurzweil, who, give him credit, I mean, he's out there very outspoken about exactly what he wants. And, you know, Jeff Bezos is talking about developing AI. And, you know, we have Elon Musk coming forward and saying, well, you know, I warned people about AI taking over 10 years ago, but no one listened. So now I'm creating Neuralink, which actually plugs your brain directly into the computer, and that's the end of that. Steiner talked about the electronic doppelganger, which is, it's an aspect that goes pretty deep. I mean, in the work of things like Theosophy and Anthroposophy, they assume the individual has a physical body and then an etheric body outside of that, which relates to its physical body. It's like an aura, in essence. And then the astral body, which is a whole, you know, it holds the entire bit of your spiritual development. And like mystics, for example, take their astral body and and travel to different places and come back. And the easiest way for us to understand the astral body is to think about in sleep time. You know, we go off and dream. Well, that's the astral body. So the electronic doppelganger is quite interesting because in Steiner's world, there's a kind of connection that can happen. Basically, there's a sort of replacement of our normal intuitive abilities, where our harmonic forces stand in and give us the ideas that we think and adopt the direction of our lives. And the temptation is towards this science, which becomes like worship of a super god, if you get right down to it, because it's going to guarantee you immortality. It's going to, you know, heal the sick. It's going to do all the things that in the past people used to rely on religion for. So we get into a very tricky space with science where, you know, if we don't apply the kind of deeper esoteric truths in a scientific method, the way spiritual science does through anthroposophy, for example, we're just going to be left at the mercy of science and saying, well, you know, so much for that spiritual side of things. Doesn't matter. All that matters is this physical life and the scientific things that I can prove. So that's the wave that came in 1840 and really led to the atomic bomb and all the problems that we're in now, where we can't seem to get that balance going between human spiritual evolution, human evolution on the planet, and this incredible rush of technology. We're hitting it face on. And, you know, we've seen just 70 some odd years ago what the effects of that were with World War II. And, you know, you go to war with these weapons, it's going to be a pretty rough time. So humanity has to face this kind of trial that we're going into it. And the work of anthroposophy is basically saying, if you don't go in to this battle with Ahriman, which is this incredible kind of technological astral entity, then it's going to be easy for them to kind of seduce humanity and sort of cut off humanity from its natural evolutionary step and move it off into this unnatural step, which is, you know, it's very strange eighth sphere. And I'm going to go deeper into what the eighth sphere is. But basically, as a shorthand, let's just use virtual reality for now. Because if I project my soul mind, my deeper esoteric self, into a virtual reality that doesn't actually exist, I can get caught there. I can get trapped there and not go on my normal mental, physical life. You know, one of the fascinating things when Elon Musk was talking about uploading his consciousness into a machine, I was thinking, you've obviously never read anything about your chakra system or your endocrine system and how your soul sits in that system. And you can't project your soul into a machine. You know, it's an absurd thing. The way he was talking about it was in this kind of like, hey, this is what we'll be able to do. Won't it be great to have your consciousness in a machine? Very, very, you know, I was shocked that these are the people that are at the vanguard of our technological advancement. At least on the surface, they don't sound like they have any kind of spiritual understanding at all. And that's extremely dangerous. Wouldn't you agree, Ms.
I
Anita?
would.
Yes.
It's deeply disturbing.
I do remember you being disturbed by that one. So here we are, and it's fantastic, by the way, to have everyone here. You're watching Dark Journalist. We're going deep on Rudolf Steiner and his vision of Ahriman. Now let's take a look at Ahriman, because Steiner's sculpture, upon deep meditation of the subject, brought us this image of who Ahriman is. And I take this very seriously because of the incredible depth that Steiner had, be it his work in biodynamic farming, in the Waldorf schools, developing eurythmy, developing sculpture programs, Camp Hill villages. I mean, it's quite remarkable. So what he brings basically to his students there at Anthroposophy in spiritual science is this knowledge of Ahriman. And then he tunes into what Ahriman is, and he gets this impression of dealing in granite, that he's becoming heavier and heavier, just getting close to it. And then this is the image that comes to him. Let's take a look at some of the really special ones I ran across. And these are actually at the Goetheanum, the new one, because of course the Nazis burned down the old one, and the new one is quite phenomenal. But one of the things I think that's remarkable is that the older Persian version of this. Let's look at this. This is the actual Darius. This is the Battle of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman in Persian mythology. And as you can see, he has that sword thrusting directly into the stomach here. And then he's also holding the horn. So he has to subdue the Ahrimanic forces mentally on the head side, and he has to get them in the lower physical side. And he has to maintain that. It's kind of like a 24/7 visual. It's very much like Michael and the Dragon. So their biggest concern there is that in the Persian mythology, they're equally matched because they're twins. And that I think is quite important because they have the same abilities. I think that's basically what they're trying to spell out for us there. Another depiction, and I love these, but I think it gives us an idea. This is Ahura Mazda pursuing Ahriman, who's very Chimera-like there. And he is definitely taking on those deep animal aspects. And he is in this kind of battle to the death with Ahura Mazda, who is the kind of the force of good and evil. He's the hero of the story. He is the kind of messiah figure. This one I've always found interesting, which has Ahriman. This is a Steiner sculpture inside the Goetheanum. Very unusual, holding up these three fingers and a kind of strange thumb, and where that other finger is, no one knows. But the hand signal and the whole vibe of it, again, this is what Steiner was getting when he's tuning into Ahriman. And Ahriman is this force that's closing in now that Steiner is warning everyone about. And he sounds quite far out back there talking about it, because here's Steiner, who they respect for all the work he did with Theosophy. And here he is talking about, well, in the 21st century, they're going to be handling this incarnation of Ahriman. And Ahriman is going to be coming through the technology because this is how he plans to seduce humanity into the eighth sphere. But what's fascinating is that those things have always been held back by the mystery schools. Blavatsky herself said, initiates don't talk about it. So there's a great secret associated with this. However, the period that we're in requires us to kind of engage on the question now. And both Blavatsky and Steiner indicated that in about 100 years from where they were operating from, this was going to be the nature of the battle. And so the great period is here and upon us that the mystery schools warned about. What does that mean for us? Well, let's take a look at just a couple of examples of where the society is going with this. This is you see a lot of these different depictions of these mechanical bodies holding up these beautiful faces. But just that kind of goal of where that is, creating these kind of robots, servants. You know, Edgar Cayce talked very much about how the Atlanteans had these things, and how the things didn't have a soul, and how the Atlanteans basically treated them as slaves, and how it basically distorted the entire Atlantean culture. Well, I'm afraid we're going in a little bit more along this line when we get into this kind of deep 21st century transhumanist thought. So what's one of the biggest, kind of most hardcore movements that we've seen along this transhumanist line? In my opinion, Cern is very much concerned with this transhumanist move. Now, there are things that I've been finding out relating to Cern that I'm going to put out publicly probably as early as October, and I'm going to get some of them on the record here. But what's fascinating to me is that aside from the main kind of questions that I presented about Cern, which is its gigantic budget, the things that are happening there relating to its effect on the atmosphere and its effect on the sun when it's turned on, and how other countries are now building their own, and how CERN is, as these scientists who went to sue it discovered, autonomous, and it's not subject to any law. It's like trying to sue the government of Sweden or something. That CERN has this power is incredible. Well, one of the things I discovered in my conversation with Joseph Farrell about this, and we do an episode called CERN Apotheosis, which I recommend everyone view, is that CERN was actually set up as a nuclear agency. And the person who set it up is John J. McCloy. And John J. McCloy was in charge of his Citibank on the Rockefeller boards. He's also somebody who served on the Warren Commission to go deep into the cover-up on the JFK assassination. So a real mover and a shaker, and a Wall Street mover and a shaker. And one of the only people, he shared a booth in 1936, on the 1936 Olympics, with Hitler. And he was a journalist at the time, just covering him because, in 1936, people were covering Hitler. And, it was like, hey, the thing to do, because 1936, we were doing the Olympics there. He was like, the host of the world. And he was keeping all of his other activities very secret. But certainly McCloy interviewing him is just a strange connection. But CERN as this kind of nuclear entity developed this fascination, say, over the past 20 years with this particle accelerator. Now, in this program, we've covered the Varian brothers and how they developed the first particle accelerators, along with someone named Corson, who, as we found out, goes back there to somebody, it's one of our favorite guests. It's in the family line, which is Gigi Young. And so Gigi Young landed right in the heart of the X series and has just been an incredible ally. And, we're going to have her back at the end of September. And wow, just incredible information that Gigi's been able to provide looking at these different situations. But just me looking into her family background of the Corsons has been quite an experience, because when we did an episode in August with her, and we went through Hiram Corson, who hosted H.P. Blavatsky when she was here in America. And Hiram himself had some very interesting kind of Rosicrucian roots, and we tied him into a number of things. But the story of the Corsons goes a lot deeper than that, and I want everyone really to tune in for that one when we have her back, because Gigi's becoming just this major asset for all the work that we're doing here at the X series, and we really appreciate it. And so I'll remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalists, and it's great to be here. We had an incredible Labor Day episode to start the month, and we had this kind of back-to-back thing, Friday to Monday. And then last week, we released the trailer for the X show. And, it's quite interesting because my feeling is that we're getting into real focus here with September. It's like the fall is really drawing the summer has a way of spreading that consciousness out. And here our focus is really being drawn in. And I just feel so much momentum with the ideas going forward of what we have. We have an incredible fall coming up for you with guests and shows that are just like no other period that I can think of that we've conjured up before. So it's really going to be quite remarkable. That's why I really want you on the mailing list for the newsletter. While you're there, sign up and subscribe to the show. Get behind it. Get behind the important alternative media. It's interesting because it's really no joke with the powers and the pressures that are out there shutting down independent media. If you want it, if you want the real deep ideas, if you don't want to be flooded by Newsweek and Huffington Post and other junk like that, who wants you to know if, J-Lo is getting a divorce, or the Kardashians. What is that new show called?
Oh, the Shahs of Sunset. Yikes.
We got the very rude awakening to that program. Whew, my God. So, this is the nature of it. If you like it, make sure it comes your way. Get behind the X series. Get behind the work that we're doing. Subscribe there. And I always bring in the, I mentioned Gigi Young. Gigi Young has this incredible course going on about developing your intuition. That's a really good idea. That's somebody I would get behind. The great work of Catherine Austin Fitts is a frequent guest. We're having her back shortly. Joseph Farrell, Alexandra Bruce at Forbidden Knowledge TV. We have the people. We have the great wealth of information. If we just learn to tune out the 2 minutes hate and tune out the mainstream media and get to the core of it, this is a very interesting time, because I can tell you we definitely have the right people, and it's all positioned well. So when you go to darkjournalist.com, get on the newsletter list, sign up as a subscriber, and get behind it. This is the period of time to get behind it. Like I said, my thing is that procrastination isn't it. That's the end of the procrastination. So that is that. I'm going to turn to you while I switch out, Miss Olivia. I'm getting to the next period of this. So if you have anything you want to throw in there.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I think you're going to get into it, but Fubar Biter was asking, wasn't Ahriman the serpent in Eden?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people say that Lucifer was the serpent in Eden. This goes pretty deep, and there's different views on it, I would say. In the Zoroastrian religion, though, Ahriman does show up very conspicuously as the tempter in the Garden of Eden. But it is kind of a later version of Zoroastrianism, so it's very tricky to see how that works. But I think the idea fundamentally is that something took place very early on in the evolutionary stage of our development, and these forces have been vying for us ever since. And right in the middle of it are these, very high beneficial forces, and that they are besieged on every side by these lower astral forces like Ahriman, and that humanity is sits right between the two. And that what I find fascinating when relating to the work of Rudolf Steiner is that he says, look, it's not about running from Ahriman. It's not about running from these different things. It's not like become a Luddite all of a sudden and neglect the technology. I mean, I was a technology editor for a decade. I worked in mainstream media. I understand that world quite well. The thing is, for me, I think what he's trying to get across is that we need to face up to the challenge of this thing coming in and take from it, face it and pass through it. Take from it the technological mastery, take from it the technological gifts that it brings, face it and overcome it, as opposed to getting sucked into it like the whirlpool description that Blavatsky gives at the beginning of the show. I want to really concentrate on a couple of quotes here from Steiner, because Steiner is remarkable. What's interesting to me is that he's writing in German, he's speaking in German. So many of the things that we have from him come down from these lectures. And he has his mainstay books like Cosmic Memory, Atlantis and Lemuria, Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, and an outline of esoteric occult science. So what he's saying in this, in essence, is you get to develop yourself and your freedom, and you develop your real imagination. And that while you're doing this as an entity, you are, you're sought out by these different forces that seek to influence you and take from you. And at the same time, you have other influences that are trying to help you develop. So you are kind of in the mix of this. And what happens is there are a number of tools that are left behind by these mystery schools, the deep mystery schools, which are beneficial. They call them very often the right-hand mystery schools. And they are not with the materialist initiates, they are with the high initiates. And very often those high initiates get recognized. One of the groups is they call the Great White Brotherhood. And that doesn't pertain to any kind of race thing. This was set up thousands and thousands of years ago as the name, as the idea, as the ideal. But that is basically a school. And I want to really go on the record with this. I've gotten letters from people who have said, well, I was with a mystery school for a few years and I studied with them, but it didn't really work out or whatever. Or they'll say, I worked with this group a little while ago. I don't know if it was a mystery school or not. Let me tell you something. There are levels to this thing. First of all, if you worked for a mystery school, you'd know it. That's number one. Number two, you don't get to see people from mystery schools in daily life. It's the nature of who they are. If they're initiates, they're hidden. That's what an initiate is.
Well, and that could mean that they're hidden in plain sight, right? It could be a gas station attendant.
Oh, you never know where they're going to pop up.
Yeah.
A brother, a sister in those groups could pop up in any capacity, absolutely. But check this out. The levels work like this, just for a quick shorthand. You've got the actual mystery schools, which, like I said, are very unattainable. People like Ouspensky, for example, spent his whole life looking for them. He intersected and he met Gurdjieff, who'd been inside the mystery schools, but was now operating outside on his own. So he wasn't really working for the mystery schools at that point. Then you have the lesser schools, and they teach, I'd say they know about half of maybe what the mystery schools know. And they do have their different initiates, and they do have power and influence. And then underneath that, you've got arcane schools, which are the schools that maintain the older knowledge and just feed it out kind of mechanically, but it's valuable anyway. And the arcane schools kind of keep to the letter of the law of the stuff. And the arcane schools are, it's incredibly valuable, but it's quite a jump to go from the arcane schools to the lesser schools, and then from the lesser schools to an actual mystery school is a gigantic leap. And then beneath the arcane schools are private study schools. Those schools for private study are literally an intellectual exercise, but you are invited into them. They're not public, and it is a great deal to learn something. Many of these schools, you'll do something like study Leonardo da Vinci and his work. And so that's another level down. That's beneath the arcane school. And then the very basic level are study groups. And that's about 99.9% of what you have out there, which is people who have a mutual interest. And what that develops in Steiner's work is a magnetic center among people. And that's why groups are important, because if I study something on my own, I get to a certain level with it. But if I study with a group, even a small group, then I'm developing a magnetic center, and we collectively develop a magnetic center. You and I, when we study these things, I'm in the role of just a journalist submitting facts for you relating to these things. But when we get around the mystery school information, we all learn and we all move to a deeper level of understanding. That's exactly how it should be. Does that sound right to you, Olivia?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. I'm pleased. So that's how I would think about it. So the next time you think to yourself, well, I was with that mystery school, or whatever, no, you weren't. And that's good. That's good, because there's something bigger and greater waiting for everyone. But you've worked with a study group, and there's a lot of them. Now, I will say that the public groups that became public that were mystery schools, and this is the great kind of crux of the mystery schools stuff that we've been covering, were Theosophy and Anthroposophy. And the spin-offs from that over time become spin-offs of that public mystery school. And there were groups like the Golden Dawn, of course, they fell into that category also. For the type of information I'm looking for with the X Steganography, I go to Anthroposophy and Theosophy. That's where I think the higher initiates came in. And Steiner, when he looked at Theosophy, the way that he describes it, although there were many, many problems with Theosophy, he says that true initiates stood at its cradle, and they were helping Blavatsky. There's no question about it. And Blavatsky's incredible sacrifice. We have this is something I want to bring everybody on board with this. We have such a legacy, an incredible legacy from these people. And, that's the way mystery schools work. They come out, they explode on the scene with all kinds of information, they retreat. They kind of spread seeds. And so from the Gurdjieff work to Blavatsky's work to Steiner's work in Anthroposophy, the work of Edgar Cayce, there's an incredible amount of information. And so that things that have us running over here looking for disclosure or something, or things that have us running, around in circles with 2 minutes hate or like mysterious political movements from people you never get to see, those can run into basically distractions. I mean, that's kind of Ahrimanic activity to kind of vacuum up your attention span so you don't get to the core of this kind of information. The value for me in the X Steganography is it's like the Rosetta Stone. Now we can read. With the Rosetta Stone, they had these hieroglyphs for years and years. They could not read the Egyptian mysteries. And any of the Egyptian stuff was completely baffling. All that story of Osiris and what the X was doing with him, nobody could say. Wonderful things like this picture, nobody could understand what was going on. But what happened with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone is because there was Coptic, Egyptian, and Greek there, they had the ability and realized that all three scripts said the same thing. So now, voila, we had the key to opening up how to read the hieroglyphs. The X works in exactly the same way. When the X shows up in a program that goes private, that goes black, that goes into the black budget, then we understand, oh, it's part of this system of secrecy that's being held over. When we look back a little bit and go into the mystery schools, the X does the same thing for us. That's the heart of the X Steganography. It can be a really simple, straight-ahead idea, but it gives us the key. And so I think that we move. It's different than anything that I think could be like a fad or something like that. The X information is something, because you learn steganography, you start to learn how to read the ancient text relating to the mystery schools. That's a huge, it's such a step forward that when I was first discovering and getting into it, I was finding myself realizing all these things that I'd studied and how they were opening up in a different way. That's the kind of impact I think that we're arriving at with this. Okay, since I mentioned this shot, I want to show it again because, you see this used a lot by ancient aliens and things like that, saying, well, it must be aliens or something. It's obviously relating to electricity, but that is definitely the mystery school knowledge being held there. That's what the mystery schools did after Atlantis got blown out. And what happened, if you go into those stories, and when we did the Tua de Danann, we talked about the Two-Eye Stone, which was the crystal that the Atlanteans used. Whatever they did when they set that in reverse is basically like a nuclear explosion. So those cultures were forgotten over time, and the whole thing became minimized because we had lost touch with that reality because we had been blown back to a Stone Age existence. That's the kind of thing, it is possible that could happen to us again. So we have to be very careful in this period of time. But I would say that, it's very important for us to get a handle on the fact of what happened back there. And it seems to me that the X after the fact protected technology like those bulbs we were just looking at. And that technology came from the Atlantean period. What happened is there was an effect that was created out of it. And the effect is something that I've called Apotheum, which is Apotheum. And Apotheum is something, it's interesting because it shows up, if you look for it in Greek texts, you can find it. But it's very elusive, the way that it shows up. Sometimes it shows up with that root that has the same root as apothecary. But what it represents is a change of reality. It's a differentiation of the laws of physics, and it's a reality distortion that comes about. Now, what's interesting is when I took those types of things and I was looking at the Atlantis stuff, I realized Apotheum really made sense for what they were hiding was this incredible reality distortion effect, because the way that they discussed, even Plato, discussing Atlantis disappearing in a day and a night, and thunder clouds and a great inundation, overnight. So it's a complete distortion of reality. Whatever it was that they were using was affecting the earth to such a degree. And this gets us into we talk about Apotheum, we talk about Cern, we talk about the eighth sphere. It's all kind of in that same vein. So that's really where we need to arrive at. And then when you get to the UFO file in the 20th century and what we look at now with the secrecy around it, what are all the effects that people talk about? Time, being distorted, missing time, telepathic communication, all these different things that lend itself to this reality distortion. It's very different than our ordinary reality. Now, people have said this in relation to drug experiences, and they say, well, I've gotten some emails about people saying that is Apotheum related to ayahuasca, for example. Everything that has to do with taking a substance is a different field of consideration. So a number of things happen there, and there are great advocates for that, like Graham Hancock, for example. And there are actual, like peyote cults among the Native Americans. So that's a whole different line of study. But Apotheum doesn't relate to drug use of any kind, because it has to do with your ordinary waking consciousness observing, being thrust into a non-time linear situation. So that's a good way for us to think about Apotheum. I get a lot of questions about that. And I just want you to think of it as something which, since it distorts reality, it is the kind of thing the mystery schools would hide over a great expanse of time. Okay, let's get into a couple of quotes from Steiner, and these relate directly to what we're trying to get at. I want to start with this, just to really kind of nail home the point of how they use mediums in these different groups. And I'll remind you that you're watching Dark Journalist, and we have a huge crowd tonight. What say you, Olivia? Pretty good.
It's a great crowd. You know what? I've noticed more people are actually really listening instead of chatting. You're captivating the audience.
Listen, this is it's great to be back and have everyone here. It's definitely fantastic feedback. And look at us. I mean, what's fascinating is here's 26 weeks. That's half a year of this show. And boy, have we really learned a lot together. And this is just the beginning. Like I said, when I went over this with Olivia yesterday, and, we try to check in to see how much we've put out versus how much information we have on this. And I mean, I literally think maybe 10 or 15% of the material is out. So we're getting pretty deep. So just this idea that we're looking at these groups who use mediums and what they might use them for and how that relates to the eighth sphere activity. This is how I think we need to progress this, because then I'm going to circle it around to Cern and how they use mediums. And it's going to blow your mind because I'm just going to give you a flash of what we're going to bring up. Okay. So Steiner now is speaking about these initiates that are materialist initiates. That's a new way for us to understand the split in the mystery schools too. They're working for different purposes. So here's Steiner. We have to consider these other initiates who are known within the brotherhoods as the brothers of the left, which is to say those who exploit everything in the pursuit of power that as an impulse is incorporated into the evolution of humanity. And naturally, these brothers of the less also had all sorts of expectations of what made its appearance through Spiritism. When these things came out and the mystery schools said, we're going to let the Fox sisters and other people communicate with the astral realm. So they had this expectation of what might came out of that. He said, I've remarked that it was these brothers of the left, above all, who held seances with the souls of dead people. Seance. Keep that word in mind as we go along here. For them, what was of most interest was that what would result from the spiritist seances. They gradually took control of the entire field, while the well-meaning initiates gradually lost all interest in Spiritism. We're talking about the 19th century, when this came out, and suddenly there was this craze for spiritualism. And America, in particular, was the leading edge on that. This is how Spiritism fell into what you would call the zone of power of the brothers of the left. These are equivalent to the sons of Belial, Ahrimanic influences in Atlantis. They have just as much information, just as much knowledge as the Ascended Masters do. But they're working at very cross purposes. They're working in a free will zone, trying to harvest humanity for themselves. This is how Spiritism fell into what you'd call the zone of the powers of the brother of the left. Yesterday, I spoke of these brothers of the left who felt disappointed above all because they saw that what they themselves had initiated by allowing Spiritism to enter the stage might reveal something they really did not want disclosed. For it might come out in Spiritist seances through messages from the dead, what certain brothers of the left did with souls of the dead. Given that the participants at the Spiritist seances believed they were being influenced by the dead, the very souls that were misused in a certain way through the brothers of the left might manifest themselves in the Spiritist seances. This is a very deep secret relating to the eighth sphere. These groups, these secret societies, the mystery schools with the materialist initiates, the brothers of the left, we call the evil side, the shadow side. What they do is they capture the souls of these individuals, and then when they enter the spirit world, they obtain a great deal of information from them. But what's happened is these souls, in Steiner's explanation here, get lured by these Ahrimanic brothers of the left into the eighth sphere. And when they're there, they think that they're going into a normal experience. But what's happened is they've been duped into the eighth sphere. And so when they get there, they were coming through and giving information to these mediums saying, I'm not on my normal track of evolution here spiritually. But what happens is there's a whole group inside of these brothers of the left that use the way that Steiner's representing this, that use these individuals that they've kept in a stupor, in a kind of materialist, they've weighed on them materially and got them to see themselves as not connected with a higher spiritual hierarchy. And they become fodder for what? The eighth sphere. This is exactly what he's talking about. So therefore, the eighth sphere becomes this place where they go and where these brotherhoods can use them, because when they enter that spiritual realm of life after death, they have so many secrets. They have so much knowledge, and these groups here on Earth harvest their knowledge. It's pretty deep. You can see why a lot of this stuff is hidden, and it just conforms to what I would call that war of the mystery schools that goes on. Let's go even deeper than that. There's a couple of really kind of crucial pieces to this. Let me see if I can get this one.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah, let me just mention, this book is called Secret Brotherhoods and the Mystery of the Human Double. I do recommend that. This is based on a series of Steiner lectures. Olivia, you're
Okay, so the brothers of the left, the brothers of the right.
Yes.
Have they always been split? Where did the split come from?
Well, what's interesting is, again, when you go back to what happened in Atlantis in the Steiner and Casey, you know, they're ever so slightly different, but basically Casey says you have these sons, followers of Emilius, who is this incredibly enlightened being that is leading evolution. And then you have these groups, the Belial groups, who are from this Ahrimanic dark astral projected into humanity. And little by little, the kind of physical prowess and the, you know, because the way that Casey describes it is quite fascinating, actually. I think it's an important thing to touch upon. What happens is the two-eye crystal gives them such incredible abilities, the Emilius followers, to interface with the Emilius forces. These, you know, they call them sons of the Most High, sons of the laws of one. Those are higher beings. And so the 2i crystal gave them that ability to do it, this kind of large structure, the way that we would go to a church or something now. And what happens is the Belial group uses it more like a nuclear power plant to develop weapons. They use the exact same technology that the Amelius group is using to develop their spiritual interface and contact with. They use that to develop weapons and annihilate the other, so that they'll go into a particular geography and take over the populations using the very same powers. So I think this is particularly important when you think about that. That split goes way, way back. And, it goes right into the heart of that whole thing about Apotheum that I discussed, because you have, like in Casey's narrative, the sons of Belial on one side and the sons of Amelius on the other. These are two different factions warring against each other. Little by little, the Belial group takes over. And that's really, that's where the split occurs. When it goes through the Egyptian era and when you go through these different time periods, you've got that same split. It operates. When you get to Akhenaten and King Tut, you've got those same dark forces throwing Akhenaten out and killing Akhenaten. So, what we're looking at is something that goes back to antediluvian times. And but that's a great question, because where did it come from? Well, you can tell when you go into any of these traditional Bible stories, or when you go into the deeper spiritual studies, that's exactly what they're talking about.
So Ahriman was there at the very beginning of our soul's descent into the earth plane?
Yeah, in Steiner's story, Ahriman is part of the wave of creation. He's a necessary factor. It's not like, it's not this thing. He didn't come from nowhere. He was part of creation, but the force of Ahriman and the way that it's developed in creation, in evolution, is that it's taken its toll and really become too much of a burden on humanity. And that what needs to happen with his incarnation, which is something that's supposed to happen in the 3rd millennium, if you follow Theosophy and Steiner's cosmology, humanity's moving towards this warmth of evolution, which is going to lead to a new Jupiter. And I just want to describe this for a minute, because around these planets are the seeds the etheric seeds for what they're going to be. Around this planet is the 8th sphere. So this is the way it's described. Let's just take a quick look at it before I read this. Yeah, so that you give this idea, this thing under construction, it's not physical, I can't touch it, but it is an etheric construction where we go in thought, where we go in imagination, where we go in the afterlife can be interrupted and sort of moved into this space. It's a virtual reality space, most definitely. But you can see Steiner mixing up the spiritual here with the high tech, and we're looking at it. And here we are. I think 100 years later, we can actually catch up. Let's take a look at Ahriman for a moment. This is the traditional Persian drawing of Ahriman. He's on the 8th sphere here. This is the X steganography that he's standing on. That lets us know this is the secret of the mystery schools. Because remember, these are the things that they pass down that, according to Steiner and Besant and Blavatsky, they don't want to talk about. They don't want to mention the 8th sphere, but it got out there. I said this to Olivia, which is, he's got 2 turntables and a microphone. This really does look like, and I know it's symbolic gear, but my God, does that not look like a microphone?
It does.
Quite. And I think the intensity is shown. The 8th sphere shows up in the original deck of tarot cards, called the Matoya Taroya, and Tarochi, and they're really they're more than tarot cards in terms of divination. Actually, as we've found, they're actually developmental cards. So they reflect the development of an entire civilization. This is the Montaya Tarochi. This is their Montaigne, right? Yes. Mm-hmm. That's the 8th sphere card. It's actually called the 8th sphere. So we're getting this impression of something in development there. And we have this angel looking at it like, what's going on here? But it gives us, I think, that hint. In the Steiner work around the eighth sphere, we run across images like this. Now, there's a number of things I can tell you about this image, but the actual visual of the image says a lot, especially relating to this cube here, which these forces seem hell-bent on getting their hands on. There is a kind of a vitality, a force to humanity that is of great interest to these larger forces. So when we look at the cosmology relating to Rudolf Steiner, and then we go into something like a political process and how people hide things in a political process to gain power, you're not really talking about different things. You're just talking about different levels of things, because where somebody's spiritual power resides, their political power is sure to follow. So let's keep that in mind as we go. But I think that that gives us a little bit, just a little bit on the globes. Somebody was kind enough to send me this image from the Fog Museum over here at Harvard, close by. And this is amazing, because it's another good Olivia story, actually, because every time I come up with something, you know, I was like, oh, we'll have to go to the Peabody, you know, like, okay, where are we going to find this thing? And I was looking for this particular statuette, and I was like, do we have to go to the National Archives, or do we have to go to the, you know, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York? And she's like, no, it's at the Peabody. That's about 7 miles. That's about 7 minutes from here. So, you know, and then with this one, of course, it's at the Fog Museum. Hey, it doesn't get any easier, right? That's a very Olivia thing. Just right, practical, down to earth. I'll never forget the John G. Trump papers when I was looking for them. And she was like, oh yeah, they're over at MIT. We can go over there right now for lunch, you know? So the world comes to you when you do the X series. That's basically my point. But yeah, you do a good job. So let's take a look at this image. It's a series of globes, and this is a pre-Raphaelite painting. But here again, this is coming forward. I'm going to really get into the globes idea and how they relate to the eighth sphere in a coming episode, because that is a whole episode in itself, and I'm going to show you who holds the imagery over time and how it's related to the kind of power structure, the royalty structure. That's very interesting to me, but it's not what we're here to talk about in this episode. But I do feel very much that these images are conveying to us that there is this realm that is competing with our regular evolutionary track here on Earth. And of course, I couldn't get away from showing Arthur Compton with his globe development there. And there's no doubt he got the idea for it from looking at eighth sphere material, in my opinion. So let's take this now. This is a quote relating to Secret Brotherhoods from Rudolf Steiner. The book is called Secret Brotherhoods and the Mystery of the Human Double. I highly recommend this group of lectures, which took place shortly before Steiner died. Let's start. Now, he talks about criminal esoteric activities that take place in some of these lesser or left groups. Such things have indeed been going on behind the scenes of external events during current decades. The purpose was firstly to present certain groups of people with the secret of how to dominate great masses. So setting up political figures to dominate great masses. Secrets being given out by these brothers of the left for this. So again, that's secret society activity behind the political curtain. Okay. As I indicated, first of all, the secret involves knowing how the masses who have little interest in external affairs, but who have budding spiritual capacities, can serve in preparing the sixth post-Atlantean epoch, can be thoroughly dominated, and how such domination can be put into the hands of some few individuals. Pretty interesting. This was the first purpose. The other is something that will play a great part in the future, namely to get those secrets into one's clutches for the purpose of turning in a certain direction the circumstances that have to do with the processes of disease and procreation. So these are mystery schools on the left side giving out advanced information relating to disease and procreation. Remember, disease X and gender X. That's how we started. I've already mentioned these things to a number of people. Certain circles in this materialistic age are striving to paralyze and make impossible all of humanity's spiritual development through causing people by their very temperament and character to reject everything spiritual and regard it as nonsense. That's the spiritual materialism, scientific materialism. A stream of this kind, and it is already noticeable in some isolated individuals, will become deeper and deeper. A longing will arise for there to be a general opinion, which is this: whatever is spiritual, whatever is of the spirit, is nonsense. This is what they're trying to achieve. Endeavors to achieve this will be made by bringing out remedies to be administered by inoculation. Just as inoculations have been developed as a protection against disease, only these inoculations will influence the human body in a way that will make it refuse to give a home to the spiritual inclinations of the soul. It's talking about getting injected with something which changes your attitude towards spiritual ideas. One more quote on this. People will be inoculated against the inclination to entertain spiritual ideas, Endeavors in this direction will be made. Inoculations will be tested that already in childhood will make people lose any urge for spiritual life. You see where the transhumanism is heading. This is Steiner writing in 1923. That's 95 years ago. And we have all this hubbub now. I mean, he's talking about being inoculated against wanting spiritual ideas. Somehow they come up with a physical remedy for that and everyone has to take it. It's quite bizarre.
What's amazing is, man's search for meaning. And Susan's essay that she wrote on your Facebook page today. And they seem to be in denial of literally man's need for meaning in his life. Right? That's
Susan Manowich, by the way, who is the president of the New Energy Movement, a great friend of the show.
It was a great essay.
So she put up a very interesting essay. And actually, you got a good handle on it. Do you want to say what you got?
I wish I had copied it so I could read it, but it was basically that. That was my takeaway more than anything else. That we're in a society in decline, and our material delights will not be sufficient to fulfill us because we are beings that need meaning, greater meaning for ourselves.
Yeah, and what she was saying is in the throes of the kind of disintegration of that, you're seeing all these bizarre things happen, and the culture is kind of drunk on its own way to dissolution, the same way that Rome fell, and this kind of a thing. It is quite remarkable, but that point about meaning, I think, is absolutely crucial, because it's the same thing with what Steiner is saying, that there's a force in society, in culture, to get you to forget your spiritual awareness. It's overpowering, and they're trying to do it, they're trying to legislate it through, they're trying to create the atmosphere for it. And what's fascinating is people have such a deep connection with their spirituality that the forces that are trying to do that are having one hell of a time. But we do see the effects of them degrading the culture. And it is something that we face head on. And this is the heart of the Ahrimanic forces. And what that's all for is because they are moving into this eighth sphere. They're setting it up. They've been working on it. This is a project they've been working on for a long time. And the idea is, we already see people taking on technology and kind of sucking out their day to it, and kind of it's harvesting their time and energy. Now, technology is a two-edged sword, because there are some incredible things that can be done with it, and we've seen it. And we're going to need the technology in order to face the future properly. I don't think there's any question about that. But the extent to which it dominates humanity and humanity's evolution has got to be dealt with. In that sense, Elon Musk was right. Musk building this neuro hookup, though, to project his soul into a machine shows you just how off base these people are, and just how, disconnected from their spiritual life. That mind, body, spirit connection completely just nowhere in sight. And if you've seen a lot of the coverage from the media in the past year over these different political situations that we're looking at, there's such a complete sounding the depths of moral bankruptcy. There's just no other way to put it. And now the big shutdowns where they're basically burning websites like they used to burn books in Nazi Germany. I mean, we're on this platform right now, and a lot of these platforms like Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it do that. So we can see this is where they're heading at. If they don't have their narrative in place, if there are differing visions for the future as to what's going to happen, they can't pull it off. They can't pull it off. So Steiner there talking about these inoculations, I can't help but think there's some symbolic references going on there. I do want to point out that with Steiner, a couple of things I want to show here. I was very, very lucky to get some of these images from the Goetheanum of Ahriman, which I was happy to show. I always like to show this to give us an idea of this X ceremony that Annie Besant was doing with Henry Alcott there, raising this up, and their deep, deep commitment, which, politically wound up becoming the emancipation of India because they worked so hard for home rule. And when I say there's VIPs in this X series, Besant has to be right in the very heart of that with the work that she did in taking Theosophy and really building it up into a major movement. And there were also mistakes that were made in that. But, we have to look at it from that point of view. And remember, she was the one who selected Steiner to run the German branches of Theosophy, which he did for a decade. So it gave him that background. It allowed him to build that Anthroposophy. By the time we got to 1916 and World War I was in full force, and there he is in Germany, he's seeing that the knowledge from the mystery schools hasn't hit the spot and that things are going to get worse. And he sees something off in the future, which goes beyond World War II, which is the war of all against all. So he sees this as a potentiality, and he's thinking the spiritual science is the antidote for it. But he is very kind of grim in a way around this 1916 period. He's very concerned that the mystery schools, Theosophy and Anthroposophy, publicly didn't turn this situation around, and that the world was plunged into what was the greatest war of the time. And this is a shot of him in that period. What he decides to do is quite interesting. He takes all of his secret lectures and he says, let everything out. Let everything that I've put forward just to students out. So in a way, he makes his own move like the mystery schools did in 1840 to get the secrecy off and to get the real secrets out. And that's where we get all of these lectures dealing with Ahriman and dealing with the electronic doppelganger and the eighth sphere. If you were just reading the books, you'd get hints of these things, but letting the deeper teachings out was something he decided to do, even though there was information that ordinarily the group would have kept to themselves. He said humanity has to get a handle on this. And I'm going to make a point here, which is that the Ahriman material in America was not available in an English translation until the 90s. So there were books about, with Steiner's basic stuff in them, but the translations, most of the material that we have relating to Ahriman, and by the way, a lot of that information is still not translated. That information comes largely to us only in the past 20 years. So there's an incredible world of Steiner's work that's opening up to us now. That's where we are, the Ahrimanic aspects, the eighth sphere, aspects and that larger vision of anthroposophy and the Jupiter evolution that he discusses in his cosmology in the spiritual science. And it is all about becoming free, and it is about using our imagination as higher beings. This is quite remarkable. And it is coming forward now in this period where he said the mystery schools would have another chance, that anthroposophy would have another chance. This is all related so deeply to the X Steganography. And we have this great legacy from Steiner's work and from theosophy and anthroposophy. So this is the point at where we apply the information that he brought forward and try to analyze it. And we take a look at the institutions that have pushed this information out, for better or for worse. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Olivia for questions.
All right, you better get ready. There's a lot of really deep, incredible questions.
I'm going to try.
Let's start with the first one. Brenda Fisher wants to know, could Steiner's inoculations equal brain entrainment via 5G delivery system?
It's funny. I had this, reminds me, I had this conversation with Ilana Freeland about EMK Ultra, which is the electronic version of this. And I want to relate a quick story here from Catherine Austin Fitz, which is quite interesting. And Catherine told me that she, as we all know, that Catherine was basically chased out of the government, and then they try to put her in prison and all these things because she was outing the fraud at HUD. Well, a friend of hers took her to this session which had former CIA Director George Tenet, and he was talking about how to keep America safe and stuff. And she went in there, and she is Catherine Austin Fitz. She knows these people. She knows what they're up to. But while she was there, she was getting this impression, when she was watching Tenet, that she felt this feeling, and it culminated midway through the thing when they stood up and gave him applause. And she turned to her friend who was there and said, "Didn't he give a wonderful presentation or something?" And then she was like, "Oh my God, they're using entrainment in this room because they just got to me in my brain." That's how entrainment works. And we saw some studies dealing with Candy Crush and how messages were getting through there. And we know people have been addicted to these types of things.
I had my moment.
But I will say
I'm not proud.
Now you like the physical kind of.
Well,
kid.
it's good to know it firsthand, right? To experience it and to shake it off. Right?
No question. Yeah, absolutely. We've all experienced this, but what I really see the entrainment working through is video games. I think it's phenomenal. And entrainment, basically, for people who understand subliminal messaging, entrainment's just an electronic higher level of delivery of that very same system. And one thing that we know is that in about 2000, they inaugurated this whole program in supermarkets and clothing stores, really high-end clothing stores, for people to have subliminal messages through the classical music, not to steal items. So they use this. They had a track record of it, and the entrainment is really going deep now. So yes, I'd say.
Okay, so Najat is asking, DJ, do you think the Ahrimanic mystery schools are trying to create the eighth sphere on planet Earth? And Aumar Bahadi says, what if we're already living in the eighth sphere?
Well, see, he's got it, and she's leaning toward it. We don't get the full picture of the eighth sphere, which is why I think it's something they gave us to figure out. But it did come out, and they had to address it. And Steiner realized that he had to correct certain things about it that were left erroneously on the record by AP Sinnott. And he said that Blavatsky tried to correct it, but that in truth, Blavatsky's not a great writer. She's an incredible visionary, and she's incredibly knowledgeable. And she had been through the trainings of the mystery schools as a deep, deep initiate, but she, her style of writing is a little bit chaotic, although I quite enjoy it. But in any case, he took it upon himself to resolve certain aspects related to the eighth sphere. But one of the things he did say, and he said that, very often in esoteric literature, they don't like to talk about this, which is that in imagination, in thought, we're already in the eighth sphere. In other words, it's part and parcel of our consciousness at any time to go into that state where we're under control of these other things. And, it's very interesting because when you get deep on a thought level, it goes much deeper than just basic psychology. Even Jung's work goes way deeper than basic psychology. But, psychology, giving that idea of like what's going on in your mind, why are you thinking those things, where are those impulses coming from? When you take the equation of the eighth sphere, involved with it as an influence, it's something that's there to influence you to help build its structure. It's a structure that's coming into place. It's like watching a construction. There's a house near our studio that's being built up, and we've been watching those guys put together this thing, and it's quite fascinating because you're getting that impression of a structure that's coming into being by a definite intention. And in Steiner's work, the eighth sphere, which is to draw and harvest out human imagination, human soul power, human spirituality, is in heavy-duty development, and it's where the Ahrimanic forces want to lead humanity into instead of that natural evolutionary step. This is the battle that's taking place. Okay, what else?
David Tormina says, DJ, what are your thoughts on the best spiritual defense against Ahriman? And he mentioned that getting out of the country recently, I experienced a great reduction in Ahrimanic-related stress.
Mm-hmm.
That's a self-aware person.
I imagine you mean getting out of America.
Yes. He went to Mexico.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Yeah. That type of a change, by the way, shakes up your system and gives you the food of impressions. Mm-hmm. Gurdjieff talks about that too, which is when you feed yourself those impressions, your actual mind gets to look at things in a different way. The way that I look at it is simple. Obviously, the things that draw you in that are Ahrimanic have to do with identifying with highly emotional states of being. So anytime that you're out of your center. But, when we get into this scientific thinking, we're also out of our center, even though someone could very calmly say, well, scientific materialism is your new God, and that, transhumanism is natural, and, disease X is good for you, or whatever it happens to be. So it's a weird thing. It's like a compulsion to see the world upside down and to fit in to the very unhealthy culture. So the greatest defense, I would think the work of the mystery schools is the greatest defense against the Ahrimanic influences. There's no question about it. They knew what they were dealing with. So the work of Steiner, the work of Blavatsky, Casey's work, they all act as a buffer against that. The Gurdjieff work is a very tough thing. I spent time with those people, and it is, it's a real discipline in a sense to bring the fourth way work into your everyday life. It requires that you don't, kind of wait for somebody to make a mistake. What is it? Oh, wait for somebody to burn the toast to feel alive. Mm-hmm. You start feeling that you don't rely on reactions anymore. So that's a very deep work. All of those, I think, have left methods in place that are very useful.
Right. And also just being gardening, right?
Gardening.
Yeah.
Wow. What
being
a great
close
idea.
to the earth is important. Being those humble acts, those things that bring us humility, right? Connection.
See, I can't recommend gardening because I've never done it, but
right.
But hanging out in cafes, I think it's a good start. I can recommend that.
Okay. So Titan-blooded, does Steiner say what Ahriman's plans are for the trapped souls? And Deborah Gale says, since the soul can get trapped, is there any way they can be saved or freed?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that, it's better to prevent these soul forces going into the eighth sphere in the first place. I'm sure once you're there, it's a difficult problem. A lot of this, is interesting too, because the way that he says it is goes back to the work of Ledbetter. It goes to what Casey says about thought forms. And the way that we think about things becomes the reality we arrive into. Now, it works on a physical level, a little bit slower. And we've seen all those people talking about the power of manifestation and how your thoughts create your reality. It's actually quite true. But what's interesting is in relating to things like the astral plane or what they call the spiritual world or life after death or whatever, very often those things are reported to be exactly created out of our thought forms. Our thoughts are things. They are, there's incredible value that can come out of them. So demeaning them or degrading them to the point, the way the modern culture does to get you, you know, if you've ever seen the horrible commercials or whatever, to get you to think on life at that level, that very two-dimensional level, is just to control the individual. So expansion of thought and, you know, integrating that with the higher spiritual sense seems to be the kind of remedy that prevents this Ahrimanic snowball from picking up steam. And it's interesting, you know, when Steiner talked about when he tuned into Ahriman, he felt incredible weight, like granite holding him down. He also talked about, very oddly, how Ahriman's goal was to create in the earth a gigantic deep freeze. And so, it's very odd to me, but I think the idea is that it's so heavy and it's such a material, mechanical, technological reality that is how it moves. But it's incredibly intelligent, and its science is so remarkable that it can trick average people out of their spiritual inheritance. And that's the great danger that we see in the scientific movements that we have now. Okay, what you got?
This is an intriguing question. Zazoom84. Could someone with unusual psi abilities already be in the eighth sphere?
If they're not careful, it's pretty easy to get caught up in that because the eighth sphere can pull you into it. And people who study that end of things and who've done it well, basically there's a process to it so that you don't get overtaken by those kinds of things. And a lot of that has to do with the clarity of your purpose in doing the work in the first place. It seems like when you go into these things, it's curiosity killed the cat. When you're in there willy-nilly, you're subject to many more forces. But when someone dives deep into their inner reality, it takes as much of that with them. You know, not everyone is so talented like Casey that they can completely leave their body, or like Blavatsky, and project into the spiritual realm. It's actually quite a discipline. But I want to relate a story about Casey here. And it's quite remarkable, and his work is quite an inspiration. But Casey, the way he got his ability in a past life, according to his own readings, and now so many people have just kind of drawn so much inspiration from the Casey readings, is he was actually in the desert, and he was a warrior in this lifetime, and he got shot by an arrow, and he was in the desert dying of exposure, but he wasn't dead. And so what happened was he willed himself out of his body, and he projected himself and his consciousness physically out of his body. Now, he had already had past lives as Rata, where he had this ability. But this physical ability manifested again as Casey, where he could lie down and leave his body, because during this other life, he had used his will to project himself physically out of his body. I think there are reasons sometimes why some of these people are so good at what they do. And it has to do with the traits that they've developed over a series of different lifetimes. But that's a pretty good trick. Let me tell you, very few psychics can actually leave their body to the level that Casey could, and with that much ease. Quite remarkable. But yeah, when you're in that psi state, when you're doing that kind of work, it seems like protection is paramount, and focus is a good way, I think, to prevent the eighth sphere from being dominant. Okay.
Okay, Michael Wisdom, could you please give an example of Ahriman coming through technology? And BV is saying, would a better approach to technological transhumanism involve humanity rediscovering a Keely-esque spiritual tech, or should merging with any tech be avoided outright?
Well, we went to Ravenscroft, and I put a picture of that up on Twitter and Facebook. And Ravenscroft is where the Keely technology got shipped off to Annie Besant, who hid it. That's the X-Tech, really. You know, it's fascinating. A good example would be anything in technology that's seductive, because that is generally how it works. You know, virtual reality is a fantastic example. If I'm a young person and I project myself into a video game and it shapes how I train my mental reflexes to operate, it has effects on me, not just physically and emotionally, but on a number of levels. So when you look at somebody from a theosophical point of view, they have an etheric body and an astral body. You're affecting all of those points. So when you degrade a culture, the way that this culture gets degraded by thinking, you know, I think of Neil deGrasse Tyson type stuff. You know, it's like everything is science, and let's make that cool. You know, let's make that the dominant thing, and let's just forget about the Constitution, and let's forget about our spiritual background, and let's forget about years and years of mystery school development, and just be cool and hip, and you know, just have this scientific materialism take over. That's a completely Ahrimanic thing, and it manifests through entertainment. It manifests in new discoveries. It manifests in rewriting history. You know, every time they go back there, they're writing all the spirituality out of these different things. So they're trying to say, well, actually, you know, none of these spiritual characters ever even existed or whatever. So in actual fact, I think that the Ahrimanic push is perfect transhumanism, because what it wants to do is it wants to take the human being. If you remember, in the tree of life, you've got the animal level, and the level above it is the mineral, and at the top is the androgyne. And we've gone through this a couple of times in some shows. But in essence, those who are pushing the transhumanism are trying to merge themselves with the mineral, which is the robot part, because you get the ability in spiritual life to climb up that tree of life and reach your higher spiritual development. It's an effort. You do it through these different levels. And what they're trying to do is short circuit it and get out of the physical level by projecting into the mineral level. So there's a degrading quality. There's a spiritually degrading quality to the Ahrimanic influence on humanity. And if humanity relies on Ahriman for its scientific development, then Ahriman's very happy as the scientific god of the eighth sphere. That's what they're working toward. That's where the cosmology leads you from anthroposophy.
Bear Wallace says, love seems to be a big part of the lesson here on Earth. How does love fit into transhumanism? So interesting. I have to say, I was actually shocked to see the word love. And I feel refreshed by seeing it, so thank you.
But it's just been the summer of love. Yeah, well, no, love is absolutely crucial. You know, love is the etheric warmth.
Food.
Yeah, it's the etheric warmth of the earth, and it's at the very heart of the spiritual vitality. As you know, one of these days I'll do a lecture on love. I promise you that.
But how would you say it fits in with transhumanism?
Well, that's a kind of an ego love of loving yourself as immortal and being advanced, and it's the denying of your natural advancement using your spiritual capabilities and your natural system for evolution that you're born with, and projecting it. It's a love of, you know, it's kind of a love of shiny things, I guess, in that sense. But this whole idea of loving yourself as a robot who's immortal is a love of ego. That's a different kind of love. Remember, in the Greeks, they had the agape love, which was not the ego love. It was a very different kind of a thing. It was, that agape love was self-sacrificing. It was a love of humanity. The transhumanist thing is just the opposite. There's no love in it except love for one's ego. So it is quite a challenge, I would say, and very, very tempting, which is a very Ahrimanic trait. Okay.
Okay, so Bobby Foxglove, is Ahriman necessary because evil is necessary, as no yin without yang, etc.?
Yes, facing Ahriman is absolutely necessary. Engaging with Ahriman, which is a huge technologically advanced, scientifically advanced, there's incredible intelligence about it. So, what we have from the mystery schools is wisdom. And the mystery schools have balanced intelligence and wisdom. But this thing comes in, and the way we understand it is greed. It's the kind of Belial might makes right thing. So when you're dealing with Ahriman, it's overwhelming. And that's the problem with society and the way that we're in it now here in the 21st century, is that the Ahrimanic powers are so in your face and that the showdown is on. And, we see it when we look at these different areas of control. Even the control of the internet is a very Ahrimanic thing, because if you start to spread ideas that don't favor one particular position, then it loses a lot of its momentum. So if we look at it straight up from the Steiner point of view, the eighth sphere loses when there's freedom of choice on Earth. And, what did Steiner say about it? If Ahrimanic forces had their way, they would take the whole of humanity and the wisdom of the gods and just spirit it away and rule from the eighth sphere, which is an actual planet in development. So they like the situation as it is, interestingly enough. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions.
Okay.
I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist. Please go to darkjournalist.com. Sign up for our newsletter. That's where to do it. And keep us in touch with each other. We'll send you a newsletter about once a week. And we do our shows here every Friday at 7 p.m. unless there's a holiday, and then we do extra shows. Also, we do have exciting guests coming up this fall. Absolutely fascinating. Ilana Freeland, Catherine Austin Fitz, and Gigi Young actually is coming up later in September, doing incredible work there. And some other surprises, including the ex-guest, the ex-witness. So I want to keep on with us on this Friday schedule at 7 p.m. And we will try to make, on some of those holiday ones, we start them early to make sure our European and our friends around the world get the shows earlier. Remember to sign up for the show, get behind the show, subscribe to it. And, that's the best way for us to keep online with each other and to, complete the cycle of work that we're doing here for you. And, it's quite a pleasure for me and Olivia to go through this work and to bring it out in such a fashion. But we go deep on it and spend a lot of time on it. And that's the way it's going to be. Okay, what else?
Okay, Thomas Tyson, do you have a personal way you distinguish between a mystery school and a secret society? We were just talking about that earlier today.
Well, it's tricky. I think that what have been known as secret societies are the brotherhoods of the left generally. So, a group like the Bilderberg group has a public aspect, but it's driven by a secret society. Those people do have a great deal of esoteric knowledge. I have no doubt about it, but their goals are very different than something like Anthroposophy, which is trying to, lead humanity to a higher world and keep it away from this eighth sphere type activity. So there's no question in my mind that there's a difference. Mystery schools were originally called mystery centers, and they became schools to get the neophyte, all developed so that they could join the center. So this is where, the mystery school is a mystery center. I think as long as we're working along the line of higher esoteric values, using that legacy that we have, that we're on that learning track. We're on the right track. Okay.
Okay. Kailhar wants to know which Steiner books you've been quoting from today.
Well, the Electronic Doppelganger was one, and the other one's called Secret Brotherhoods. Those are, it's not like Steiner sat down and wrote the book and was like, hey, they're a collection of lectures around topics dealing with the challenges that we have in the 21st century. There's autobiography. There's an original title. Rudolf Steiner, fascinating book.
And what is the book you recommended to me earlier to just sort of get into
his
Steiner?
most basic and most popular book, his like kind of greatest hits book, is Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. And it's a fantastic book written right in that period between running the German chapter of Theosophy and starting Anthroposophy. And it's got a lot in there. And it's a great addition to your thought resource for sure. Okay, we'll take two more questions and we're out.
I'm going to tell you when we're done. Okay.
Hey, listen, you're the boss.
I'm in charge. Okay, so
you say jump, and what do I say?
How high? Okay, Brian is asking about Waldorf schools. Are they an attempt to raise the consciousness of society/humanity? And Leilani G was asking, are Waldorf schools a breeding ground for initiates to mystery schools?
Well, I'm sure they would hope that they would be, for sure. No, I think you can regard Waldorf schools separate from Anthroposophy, in fact. Just like there are Christian community groups that are separate from Anthroposophy, that they come from it, but they've kind of over time developed their own thing. Very often, the Waldorf schools are kind of like the Montessori schools. They're very innovative methods for training young minds to kind of develop this sense of the spirit. It's absolutely crucial, and we have that. And the way that they got developed was quite remarkable too, because, well, it's a long story with that. But my basic point on that would be this, that the Waldorf schools are probably a fantastic alternative to the kind of schooling that's available, and very much on par with the kind of Montessori training. And my own feeling is that the schools themselves, when they try to explain the Steiner connection, because they've got, people, these parents are like, well, Steiner's into Atlantis, and, he's into us evolving towards Jupiter. He's got this incredible cosmology, right? They kind of don't want to hear about that. They want to know, oh, the child has an innovative learning environment, So I think the Waldorf schools kind of push that side of it. And I don't blame them. I think that's probably where they do their best work. But yeah, is that an incredible place for a young mind? Absolutely. And I've had some nieces go through there, and I think it's quite a remarkable system. And, there's going to be ups and downs with any school and these developments. So, it all depends. But certainly the curriculum that's developed around the Steiner work is phenomenal. Okay.
It's a great way to learn.
Yes.
Okay, so Brian is also asking, DJ talks of Ahriman directing our thoughts. What are your views on the role music plays in guiding our thoughts, elevating, lowering our consciousness?
Well, sound is how they developed the initiates in the Egyptian times. So think about that. There's no question sound has everything to do with it. I love music more than anything. Olivia is, my God, there's the music fan of the century. And
I'm a disco fiend.
She's a disco inferno. But I would say that for what you're talking about, if you've ever listened to the Gurdjieff music done by de Hartmann, who was one of his main pupils, that was developed by Gurdjieff, they're actually incredible recordings of just Gurdjieff playing his harmonium at the end of his life and these temple songs. And the music has the ability to change your entire vibratory, spiritual, emotional system. There's no question about it. And so, yes, it has a powerful role.
Would you share the banana anecdote?
Which one is that?
From Wayne Dyer.
Oh, no, you do it.
You do it.
He was having a discussion with his son about how he should stop listening to rap. And the son was like, I don't need to listen to you, whatever. And, Dyer is that very positive guy. And he's like, look, I'm going to explain this to you. Hold this banana up to your heart And he's like, how do you feel? He's like, great. He's like, now hold that rap album up to your heart. You know, like, how does that feel? So he was using that anecdote. And really, you know, when you get right down to it, look, everything's vibratory. This is what we've learned from Tesla. This is what we've learned from Casey. What is the nature of the vibration? It has a lot to do with the intention behind it, right? So we run into a lot of things in our daily life, which completely, you know, bad vibe city. Let's face it. And we were driving around today. I mean, the traffic was absolutely terrible. And if you're not in your center, you're going to waste a lot of energy. This is another interesting thing. And I like crossing over the Gurdjieff work into Steiner stuff. He said that it takes an incredible amount of energy to evolve, and that we waste energy in negative thinking, but in outbursts and things. It's like he calls it an explosion in the factory. The great factory of the human machine. So this is fascinating to me because I think it does take a great deal of energy to evolve properly and to be centered. So if we're spending all our energy being overly identified with different things that upset us, that's where we get into that with the alternative research community, which is there trying to upset you, trying to feed off your political disagreements and things like that. As people are trying to reveal things, we don't want to get into that state. I would say we want to avoid it. Anything, you know, if somebody starts to pop a vein trying to explain something to you, then they're throwing you out of your center. And we see that in politics, they do this all the time to whip people into this frenzy, get them out of the center, and then they control the situation. So we have to be very, very careful, I think, with that. Okay, we'll take two more.
Okay, a cult fan, please ask if Trump and other global leaders covering a glowing orb represent Ahriman's control over the consciousness.
I think this is a fascinating picture. I wish I had it handy. Look, Trump knows a lot. He knows a lot. Trump, whether you disagree or agree with him politically, his uncle was John Trump. John Trump was in the Rad Lab. We've done the shows on the Rad Lab and the Varian Brothers. And John Trump was also the person they called in to inspect Tesla's work. So he's got that tie-in. You know, he has the connection with the Asters. He knows about the advanced technology. He knows about the X-Tech. So the question is, how does that affect the things that he does? Once in a while, when you get those photo ops, and that one was with, I think it was the government of Arabia and Yemen, or no, it wasn't Yemen, maybe Qatar. But I do feel that when he's in that situation, in that environment, that, you know, there are some photo ops that are interesting. There's a lot of claptrap, mostly coming out of the Q world about, you know, him, and there's a lot of nonsense. I have to explain this real briefly, that dark journalism comes out of these three levels of understanding, and I want to explain this. The first level is the official story that we get from the government, usually. That's like, you know, the 9/11 anniversary passed recently. They said, well, 3 hijackers flew into these buildings and we couldn't stop them. That's the official story. And then the counter story is the second level, and that is often called the conspiracy theory, but it usually comes from professors and deep researchers and writers and people, concerned citizens. And then the third level is junk conspiracy. And the junk conspiracy is often put there to cancel out the second level that's questioning the official story. And it's often placed there by the official story forces. We get a lot of junk conspiracy in alternative media. Unfortunately, that's the bane of alternative media, and the official story is the bane of the mainstream media, because those two things, between those two forces, it's very hard to get to the truth. But right in that middle line, somewhere down the middle, is the dark journalism that can go and investigate with the counter story what the real details are. When you get junk conspiracies like Flat Earth, and you get junk conspiracies like JFK Jr. is alive and running a secret thing with Trump, it's insanity. I mean, that is meant to get you out of your center so that you don't look deeper into things and you just fritter off and your focus leaves.
Najat was asking if you think John Trump was part of any mystery school.
I think all of those guys were associated with Masonic, that is the Rad Lab guys. And we know that Vannevar Bush was the master Mason. of a Grand Lodge and that he took over the MIT Lodge, they know about secrecy in Mason schools very well. And, you know, it's an interesting thing about Masons because there are levels there, but in regular Masonry, they don't have access to anything of a deeply esoteric mystery school. But their deeper levels of the Masonry have access to all of it. So, you know, but you can ask someone who's a Mason, you know, something relating to the eighth sphere or something. They're not going to know anything about it because they're just on that basic study. Remember the levels that I gave you earlier? They're just on the basic study level. So they're not through the arcane level. They're not through the lesser level. There's a lot of levels when we consider these things. Okay.
Okay. Giovanni Delgado. What does DJ make out of the closing of solar observatories worldwide? And Mermaid Moxie was asking, is that Space Force related?
Well, it is very strange, and I am trying to get information on it that is useful. I think it's always strange when you get into something where the Department of Homeland Security or the FBI is closing something that seems pretty innocuous. Why would they close an observatory there in New Mexico? It's something we're still working on. So when I get some better information, I'll give it to you for sure. I do feel like it's a story like the Hawaiian alarms were last summer, which needs to, you have to go a little bit deeper in order to understand what we're talking about. It's like, some people flew off the handle and said, well, there was a nuclear missile fired from North Korea, and that's why the alarms went off. Or like, we bombed deep state facilities. It's a lot of junk conspiracy. But the fact is, those alarms were strange enough. This thing with the closing of the observatories, you know, we have to get a handle on it. So we have to look at it logically and be careful of clickbait headlines on it and just get right to the heart of it. That's dark journalism. We want to throw out the junk conspiracy almost at the outset and go for the real story. You know, if they're saying, you know, some of the official story around this right now is there's some kind of solar hurricane out there and we need to commandeer these facilities. I mean, there's a lot of very unusual things about it, but the story's too early for us really to know anything, unfortunately. But it is fascinating, and we'll do more on that. Okay, we'll take one more.
We're going to take about 3 more, okay? So, but they'll be quick. All right, Harry Hunkinen. On Wednesday, the president signed a state of emergency regarding foreign meddling in American affairs. Not a peep in MSM. Any comments?
Yeah, well, I noticed that too when there was this thing about us bombing. You know, the Russian Defense Ministry said we bombed in Syria with a phosphorus bomb, and nobody covered it. The media has gone into even a stranger tailspin than it's been in before. It's just this bizarro zone. But I think that thing about the sanctions against any country that meddles with us is more of this Russian narrative, and the Russian narrative has never paid off. And it seems to me it's kind of Trump's way of getting them off his back, saying, yeah, I'm with you on that. They shouldn't do it. You know, Trump didn't get into office by meddling. He got into office through the failure of the Democratic Party to provide a good future idea and candidate. And Trump, you know, with his flaws and everything else, he broke through the verbal barriers, and people liked that he was talking about real things like, you know, basically the question about where America was headed and all the rest of it, and the Make America Great Again thing. What was happening with the Obama kind of corporate government idea was they wanted to split up the world into these different corporate zones, like the North American Free Zone. And we've seen where that's gone in China with the suicide nets and things like that. So I think that people got from Trump something different. That's why they voted for him. It had nothing to do with Russia. But I will say this, that, you know, if you like Trump or don't like Trump, whatever it is, you know, and sometimes we get people in office that we can't stand, whatever it is, the CIA should not be allowed to push out a sitting president. I mean, it's a simple thing, and that's what they're trying to do through the media in combination with these corporate groups. Because remember, the CIA was spawned from Wall Street. The first, you know, major force on the CIA was Alan Dulles, who was a Wall Street lawyer from S&C. So let's not forget where these people come from. Okay, you're up, Olivia.
Okay, Marco Andre Silva. Is not the AI, as it is being programmed, a manifestation of what C.G. Harrison called physical intellectuality? And are we not a spiritual step ahead of it?
Well, I hope so. The AI is this. We're going to do a show specifically on the AI transhumanist aspect versus the mystery school knowledge. This was a setup, kind of breakthrough episode for dealing with that. And we have some real breakthroughs in it. But I would say this, that the AI runs the risk of bringing that eighth sphere into physical manifestation and fast. So it runs the risk of falling under that Ahrimanic push. And I think that's predominantly where it's come from. And I think that's what these mystery schools were warning us about 100 years ago. Are we ahead of the curve? Well, when you look around, do you see people's consciousness rising, or, is it getting more control? And I think it depends. It really depends. But I think there's an urge there for it to rise. For sure. Okay.
Joan Gogol said, so what would be Ahriman's greatest enemy? You sort of answered that, but she answered her own question, which is, I think you need to be love. And I really like that answer. And that's it, really. Do whatever you need to do in order to cultivate an open heart, a loving heart. And Kate Tower, I'm going to give her the final quote, which she said, 3 things in human life are important. The first is to be kind, the second is to be kind, and the third is to be kind. And that's a quote from Henry James. Isn't that great?
Well, he has the right idea, of course. But see, that gets into what he said about being human. That's not something you're going to get from a machine. The funny thing is, the idea of technology advancing humanity is a natural step. That's all very normal. I embrace the technological innovations more than anybody. I love the stuff. But the capacity for dumbing down the majority of the population so a small group can centralize and harvest those people is that's what we're talking about. That's the danger. And if you don't deal with the danger, you're going to be deep in cleaning up the mess eventually. I'm going to close out with this picture of Madame Blavatsky with the Ascended Masters. Very important picture for a number of reasons, because of the great wonders that she brought forward. And then we're going to think about that, and then we're going to think about Alice, which is Alice Cern doing the particle acceleration experiments. And the difference there in those two visions is quite remarkable. The scientific materialism closing in, guiding the society in this direction of, basically cleaving the spiritual reality from it and excising it, versus really integrating those two things, which is what spiritual science and anthroposophy is all about.
Sarabella Guignac
Yes.
just wrote something very disturbing. I don't want to end on this note, but she says, Hulu has 9 licensable patents that work from behind all digital screens, omitting hypnotic alpha light, suppressing cortex, dumping 350 words a minute into the super and subconscious mind.
Well,
Ugh.
listen, they're ready, they're getting ready. And we're getting ready too. That's the point. I do want to say this, that in terms of Steiner's work, it's obviously going to be a touchstone in the X series, and it's a fundamental tool, I would say, for dealing with the situation we find ourselves in. As Steiner predicted it would be, this is the time for us to take it on. But we're going deep, so we're going to be with you next Friday at 7 p.m. Miss Olivia, what can I say? Fantastic.
You did
tonight.
great.
Unbelievable. Thank you for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you to everyone for being here with us. We're going to have X number 27 next week. We're going deep with you in the fall. Remember to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, get on that communication link with us, support the show, get behind the show, subscribe. to the show. We've made it very easy to do that and get access to those deeper levels. We're going to be putting together also indispensable materials for the X series relating to these X pages that we're working on now. We're going to roll those out for you probably October 1st. So get in there, get behind the Dark Journalist show, and make sure when you're looking at this material that, you know, the Steiner work, the theosophical work, there's a lot of prejudices out there, or people trying to draw on different things. And some people say, well, Blavatsky shouldn't have done this, or Poisson shouldn't have done that, or like, you know, different conspiracies or whatever. At the very end of the day, what they produced was an incredible opening for humanity in this period, and it is the opening that we need and that we find is so very necessary. So we're grateful to the mystery school traditions for doing that, and for these brave people who gave their lives to bring us this information. And so we're carrying on that legacy and really, you know, together learning about it. And I'm doing, you know, a lot my best presenting it to you, but you really are rising to the challenge also in finding incredible information for us. So we really appreciate it.
Thomas Tyson wrote a limerick for me. I'd like to read it.
Oh, yes, here we go.
Okay. There once was a lady named Wings Girl, played Candy Crush once in a binge whirl, but she left that behind to develop her mind and to let her potential unfurl. Well done.
That's pretty good. That's pretty
great.
Good. You should be writing commercials, let's face it. It's fantastic to see everyone out there. David Termina, excellent. And, you know, we've had Cliff High in there a few times, and Cliff High has always been a very compelling voice out there, whatever he's into. And, you know, he always contributes great things to the conversation. Thanks a whole bunch. And Giovanni, we see you out there. Najat, a cult fan. So many great people out there tonight. We will see you next Friday with the X episode 27. And make sure you check out the trailer too, because I think you'll enjoy it. And anything else, Olivia?
That's it.
Lydia,
thanks, everybody. You did great. Fantastic questions tonight.
what's for dinner?
I'm starving. I guess pizza. It's got to be
Pizza.
but no tequila.
No tequila.
You guys don't know
there's-
this,
there's
but I
a-
had a tequila
there's a-
incident, and I will not be drinking tequila for a while.
There's a story behind that. And you have to be a real insider to get that one.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll never tell.
It's real inside baseball there. But yes, so we will see you soon. Thanks so much for being with us. A huge crowd tonight. Really appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
We'll see you next week. Tequila.